And now, back to the Dr. A Show with your host, Dr. Will Aguila.
Daniel Bergner is a contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine and the author of several books of nonfiction, including The Other Side of Desire, In the Land of Magic Soldiers, and God of the Rodeo. Daniel has achieved multiple awards and recognitions for his writing. His newest book, What Do Women Want?, offers a new perspective on female desires based on research forcing the reader to reconsider long-held notions about female sexuality. Daniel, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Now, wow, you have taken on a very big challenge to answer the age-old question of what women want. Why do you think this has been such a difficult question to answer in the past?
It was a challenge, I should say that for starters, and I hope that listeners won't think it's strange or sometimes they're worried even arrogant that a man is posing the question and writing this book. I did a lot of listening over 8 years' time to scientists, most of them women, and then to individual women whose stories are threaded through the book. But in answer to your question, I think we've had a kind of fear of female sexuality, even in our society today that can seem so sexually unrestrained, and we've lived with a lot of myths about women's sexuality, so I'll just start with one. We've long been told that men are programmed by evolution to spread their seed, to be promiscuous, and women, by comparison, to seek out one good man, and thus to be relatively well-suited to monogamy. I think science is now telling us something very different, that when it comes to sex, monogamy may be just as much of a problem, maybe even more so for women than for men. And so I think we're starting to see a picture of female sexuality that is more driven, that ultimately I think is more empowering, and in any case we're starting to get an understanding that's much more candid and clear.
Do you see that women are actually quite receptive to this?
Well, I do, yes, and certainly I've been very flattered by most of the reviews, which of course have all, I think, been written by women, and who've welcomed this as a bit of an eye-opener, as a bit of a sort of foundation shaker. As one of the scientists I spend time with says, you know, my work is an attempt to shake the foundations of the way we see female desire, and indeed she's right, and I hope this book does that too. I hope it starts a more honest conversation between men and women about sexuality, and particularly about women's sexuality.
Now, traditionally, what have been the accepted perceptions of female sexuality? What are the accepted ones? Okay,
so number one I mentioned was kind of relatively well-suited to monogamy, not straining under it, not thwarted by it, but naturally pretty well made for monogamy. Two, kind of less raw, less animalistic than male sexuality. So while men are expected to be fantasizing a lot and have eyes roaming, women, not without sexual drive, of course, but less so than men. Those are for starters. I'll tell you about another interesting set of experiments that the first scientist I spent time with was doing when I came into her lab for the first time 8 years ago. She was showing women a wide array of sexual images, and then measuring, comparing what women say turns them on versus what their bodies say, using a little device called a plethysmograph. And so she was showing straight women straight images and gay images, all kinds of things. And the women's bodies were responding really strongly to all of it, and it was kind of the beginning of a wake-up call to say, number one, women are clearly responding to visual images, so that's another assumption we've got to cast aside, that women are less visual than men. And then also just the range of images was so striking. It sort of took the blinders off a bit and turned assumptions upside down.
Why do you think these ideas are perpetuated, even though there's scientific evidence to prove otherwise?
Well, because I think that we men are very comforted by the idea that our women's sexuality is kind of more subdued than our own. I mean, think about it. We get to walk around having our fantasies, having our eyes roam, and being told by society, well, he's just a guy. That's okay. That's natural.
Yeah.
And we get, meanwhile, to have the soothing idea that our women are more or less focused on us. And, you know, in the end, this does us, men, I think, a very strong disservice because it dampens, it puts constraints on women's sexuality in a way that can only rob the couple of a kind of stronger erotic energy. So one of the things, you know, people sometimes now ask me for advice, even though I think of the book much more as a book of insight than it is a book of advice. But I'll say this. If men were willing to listen more openly, even when they feel a little threatened by what their partners are saying, I think we'd all be a lot better off sexually.
So then we wouldn't really actually need a book to tell us that.
Well, that's true. I'm probably undermining my own cause here. But I would say, again, what I hope the book does is really start an honest conversation.
And there's a lot of great information in this book and a lot of surprising information. Now, you talk about emotional intimacy and close attachments and unconditional love. What does that really do for women's sexuality?
Here's another one of these conventional assumptions that women's sexuality is all about intimacy and is sparked by emotional closeness. And let me give you just a couple of examples that might give us a new picture. So going back to those comparisons between what women say and what their bodies say, so Chivers compared handsome stranger to equally handsome and trusted close friend. And women, on average, said very strongly that the close friend would be the bigger turn-on. Their bodies said something very different. Now, the body is not everything, but again, a kind of wake-up call to say, have we merely kind of told women over and over again for centuries, really, since Victorian times, that they need the trusted, close companion rather than what we men might choose, which is the raw experience. Another example, just, you know, sometimes I would, although the book is mainly stories about women, spent some time in primate centers, just curious, like what do our evolutionary ancestors have to tell us? So, you know, for a long time, till very recently, we were taught by scientists that male monkeys are the aggressors in war, the aggressors in sex, the initiators. And again, if you take the assumptions away, and it's amazing how strong those assumptions are, they've almost blinded us, take those assumptions away, watch side by side with the primatologist as I did, and you see it's the female monkeys who are the aggressors in war, the female monkeys who are the initiators in sex, the female monkeys who are doing the objectifying of the male monkeys, and most kind of humorous of all, the primatologists have to cycle out, get rid of the male monkeys every 2 or 3 years, because the female monkeys get tired of having sex with them, kind of bored, and won't have sex with them any longer. All of this goes to show, I think, or begins to suggest, say, that old model of women need emotional closeness to feel a sexual energy is not quite right. And indeed, the therapists who are willing to talk candidly are no longer talking about, hey, emotional intimacy, guys, is the key to sexual charge. That's not to say that emotional intimacy isn't important. I'm a romantic. I'm in a monogamous relationship. I'm not throwing away my monogamous relationship, and most people aren't going to throw away theirs. But it is to say there may be other things, other factors that are more important when we're really just focusing on that erotic electricity.
And it's important to understand that when you're trying to create a close relationship with somebody you love, a woman, a spouse, or your significant other, to understand that. Only by understanding that will you be able to let her express herself the way she wants to. I
think so. And, you mentioned that phrase, unconditional love. And here's the problem I have with it, even as I want it for myself. I'm completely sympathetic with that wish to be loved no matter what and desired no matter what. But the problem with that idea is that really we end up turning our partners into parents who are pretty much the only people we ever have a chance to be truly loved unconditionally by. And if we really think about it, and I'm talking about men and women, shouldn't really aim for unconditional love from our partners. What we should be doing is earning our partner's love and lust every day, and that's what keeps the energy strong. And the ironic thing about it is that I think when that sexual energy stays strong, it brings you back to the closeness you've wanted the whole time. So it like circles around and brings you the emotional benefit as well. But you've got to see, I think, that unconditional love is one step away from kind of taking for granted, and that's what you never want to do if you want to keep a relationship erotically strong.
Very well said. Absolutely true. We're speaking to Daniel Bergner, and his newest book is called What Do Women Want? What a question, huh? More on this interview with Daniel Bergner and What Do Women Want when the Dr. A Show continues.
And now, back to the Dr. A Show with your host, Dr. Will Aguila.
Welcome back to the show. We've been speaking to author Daniel Bergner, and his newest book is What Do Women Want? Basically, this is a book about research that's forcing readers to reconsider long-held notions about female sexuality and what that means to you. Now, very interesting part of that book is where you talk about narcissism, and you say that narcissism plays a role in female sexuality, Daniel. How is that?
Right. Well, the researcher and therapist who introduced that to our conversation, I should say, meant narcissism not in a critical way, but just was using the word descriptively, just to mean the desire to be desired. And what she argued, and I think very persuasively, I heard this over and over from the individual women whose stories I tell in the book, is that the desire to be desired plays a particularly strong role in women's sexuality. So just to give you a quick example, so I tell the story of Isabel, who's a 30-year-old woman trying to decide, kind of tormented by the decision about whether to marry the very attractive, adoring boyfriend who she's lost her desire for. And part of the problem is that he doesn't have a way, it's kind of not in him, to express his desire with strength in a kind of fierce way, in an almost uncontrollable way. And she misses that. She had that in a previous boyfriend. And I think her story sort of exemplifies that spark of being desired, desiring to be desired, that may be at the heart of many women's sexual, erotic feelings.
Now, there are multiple romance novels out there that are read by women and describe fantasies of a woman being overpowered, in a good way, by a man that she is attracted to. Now, what does this mean, and why is it so common? And how is that related to the desire of being desired?
Really good question, and let's underline first that none of this discussion changes one bit of no means no. We've got to draw a really bright line between fantasy, between what romance novels offer us, even, with what 50 Shades of Grey offers us, and what is wanted in reality. So that said, though, I think that fantasy of being overpowered sexually has to do with a lot of things. One, it's the ultimate expression of that uncontrollable desire that has so much electricity. Another thing is it kind of takes away the shame of sexual desire for women. And this is an important point that we haven't touched on much yet, and that is, in our society, there's still a double standard. I have a 20-year-old daughter, and we talk about this a lot. There's still pretty prevalent slut shaming, so-called, that is a woman, young woman, or even an adult woman who has beyond a certain number of sexual partners is considered a slut and kind of spurned. There's no such thing, of course, as stud shaming, and that kind of says it all. There's a double standard, and the overpowerment fantasy is not only a really strong expression of the desire to be desired, but it's also a way to lift responsibility and so you don't feel that shame. I think those are two of the factors that are involved, and two of the things that are involved in 50 Shades is popularity. Another is this, and I get to this in the chapter at the end of the book. I try to take readers into what fascinated me, which was sort of the neural pathways of desire, our brains are kind of like muscles. The more we use certain pathways, the more they develop. And one of the appealing ideas about understanding the attraction of 50 Shades is the more we're fantasizing, the more women are fantasizing, living through this vicarious experience, the more they're kind of building up those desire pathways and giving themselves more access to, to the neurotransmitters of desire, of lust.
So there's nothing wrong with them reading those novels. It's actually a good thing.
I think it's a good thing, absolutely. Look, again, this is about the luxury we men have all the time, permitted completely to be sexual by our culture, and this is sort of you're talking about one corner of the literary world that offers that to women. I just wish the sort of constraints would come off for women as well, in all kinds of other ways, because I feel like women are burdened in a way. They're burdened by this idea that they're supposed to be monogamous, and that makes them feel like they're somehow doing wrong if they're not perfectly satisfied with monogamy. I tell a story of a 58-year-old, very proper Southern woman, loves her husband mightily, but feels like something's missing sexually in her life now, and what to do about it. That feeling can be more of a burden to women, I think, than it is to men. So I wish that would change. I think a really candid conversation would do so much, to help all of us, really, in our erotic lives, our erotic selves, and to me, anyway, that erotic self is central to who we are as human beings.
What happened in some studies where they did with speed dating events, and the roles were reversed?
Yeah, so interesting to me. So in speed dating, usually the men approach, the one way to picture it is just picture a series of women on a banquette, and in a speed dating event, the men come down the line, introduce themselves, have a quick interaction, and at the end of the night, everyone checks a box whether they want a second date or not, and they might rate their desire for each of those possible dates. Well, in typical speed dating, men choose a lot more second dates too, and people have assumed this means, well, women are choosier and men are more promiscuous. But ingenious researchers, a pair of ingenious researchers, decided to flip the thing around, and they had women approach. And it was astonishing. The result, the switch was almost immediate. Suddenly, women were checking boxes as often as the men, showing as much desire as the men. And it just goes to show you that what we take for granted in our society, the societal structures we all live by without thinking about them, really have a profound effect on this central emotion of desire.
So how does this science help us understand women better for, let's say, a single guy in the dating scene?
Okay. So a single guy on the dating scene needs to take a breath, be willing to, as I said earlier, listen to the woman he's beginning to be with, let's say, to ask questions with the full intention of hearing the full answer. And because women are automatically going to be hesitant to give a full answer for all kinds of reasons, they don't want to be branded as slutty, they don't want to seem too aggressive, and for sure they don't want to threaten our fragile male egos. Because of those factors, I think men have to be willing to sort of ask the question twice and say, I really want to know the answer, and then sit tight, hold on to the sides of your chair if you need to, and just listen. Just be silent and listen. I guarantee you will be the better for it. It will help you in the relationship that you're embarking on.
How about a man who's in a happy relationship with his wife but wants to keep the marriage fresh?
Well, I think that's a great situation you set up, because I'm assuming that happy relationship means they are still in an erotically charged relationship, still really drawn to each other.
That's exactly what I mean. But if you don't keep it that way, if you don't put effort into it, it falls apart like anything else. So what do you do?
I so agree with you, and here's what I'd say, and I've learned this lesson way too late in life, but I'm following it now. Go early to a session or two of couples counseling. Find a couples counselor who's willing to talk about sex. A lot of them, believe it or not, are too uncomfortable themselves to do it. Find a couples counselor who's willing to talk about sex, and then have a candid conversation. What is working? Of course, you don't really need a counselor. You could do this yourselves if you're brave enough. Talk about it. Talking about it will not ruin it. It will just make it more secure, more hot, really, and it will be the building block for keeping it going later.
And don't be afraid to let her take. And don't be afraid to let her take the upper hand too. I mean, let her take control too, and let her express herself. And I would imagine. Absolutely,
I think that's what I've been saying all along: is be willing to listen and be willing to do what she's asking. I mean, that's absolutely key. Without that, you're not going to get anywhere. But with it, I guarantee, things are going to be much more powerful between you.
And very quickly, because we're running out of time, but how about a man whose marriage is falling apart or is on the rocks?
Well, again, I'd say candor at the start. I mean, look, therapist after therapist would say that is a really difficult situation. Maybe don't expect a miracle right away, but start with some honesty. That's the only way to build or rebuild a real sexual relationship.
Daniel, this has been a great conversation. Once again, the book is called What Do Women Want? You can find it at bookstores everywhere, and you can also go on Daniel's website, Daniel Bergner, BERGNER.com. Daniel, thanks again.
Thank you so much.
And that's our show for today. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to follow us online on thedrashow.com and also on Twitter and Facebook at Dr. A. White Moss. Until next time, this is Dr. A wishing you a healthy and happy week.